You know that strange guilty feeling you get after saying no to someone? Not anger, not relief, something heavier. Maybe a friend asked for a favor when you were already exhausted. Maybe your boss dumped extra work on you at the last minute. Maybe your family expected you to show up somewhere, even though your mind and body were practically begging for rest. And for once, instead of automatically saying yes, like your nervous system was on autopilot, you said no. You finally protected your time. You finally chose yourself. So why did it feel so bad afterward? Why did your chest tighten like you had done something wrong? Why did your brain suddenly start opening 20 imaginary court cases against you at 2 a.m.? They probably think I'm selfish. I should have just done it. What if they stop liking me? It's strange, isn't it? People talk about boundaries like they're some magical self-care superpower. But nobody really talks about the emotional hangover that comes afterward. That weird draining sensation where protecting your peace somehow makes you feel guilty, anxious, and emotionally exhausted. And psychologically, there's a very deep reason for that, because saying no is not just a social action. To your brain, it can feel like a survival risk. Human beings are social creatures in a way that's honestly kind of dramatic. Your ancestors survived because they belonged to groups. Being accepted meant food, protection, warmth, and safety. Rejection, on the other hand, could literally mean death. So over thousands of years, your brain became highly sensitive to anything that might threaten social connection. Which means when you disappoint someone, even in small, harmless ways, your nervous system sometimes reacts like you just endangered your survival. That's why a simple text message saying sorry, I can't make it, can somehow feel emotionally equivalent to jumping out of a moving airplane. Your brain hears boundary. Your nervous system hears possible rejection, and here's the uncomfortable part. If you grew up being rewarded mainly for being helpful, agreeable, or emotionally available, saying no may feel even worse. Some people learned very early that love felt safest when they were useful, maybe. You were the easy child who never caused problems. Maybe you became the emotional therapist in your family before you were even old enough to understand your own feelings. Maybe people praised you most when you sacrificed your needs quietly and smiled while doing it. Over time, your identity can slowly fuse with people-pleasing, not because you're weak, because your brain adapted intelligently to your environment. Psychologists sometimes call this conditional acceptance. You unconsciously learn, I receive connection when I make life easier for others. And once your nervous system learns that pattern, boundaries start feeling emotionally dangerous because every no quietly threatens the identity your brain built to stay loved. This is why some people feel physically drained after setting boundaries. Their body is experiencing internal conflict. One part says, I need rest. Another part says, but what if they're disappointed in me? And disappointment feels enormous to a brain trained to prioritize harmony over self-protection. You can actually see this. It happens in real life all the time. Someone agrees to attend an event they desperately don't want to go to. They spend the entire week emotionally exhausted thinking about it. They complain internally the whole time. Their social battery dies halfway through the night. Then afterward, they feel resentful and confused. But if they had simply said no earlier, they would have felt guilty instead. So many people end up choosing resentment over guilt. Because resentment arrives later, guilt arrives immediately. And your brain prefers immediate social comfort, even if it creates long-term emotional exhaustion. That's the trap. Your nervous system often confuses short-term discomfort with bad decisions, but psychologically, growth almost always feels uncomfortable at first. Think about learning to swim. The first few times your body enters deep water, panic takes over. Your muscles tighten. Your breathing changes. Your brain screams, absolutely not. Not because swimming is wrong, because unfamiliarity triggers alarm. Boundaries work similarly. If you spent years automatically saying yes, then saying no feels psychologically unnatural. Your brain interprets the new behavior as danger simply because it's unfamiliar. And honestly, this is where a lot of people quit. They assume if setting boundaries feels this bad, maybe I'm doing something wrong. But discomfort is not always a warning. Sometimes it's just evidence that your nervous system is learning a new pattern. There's also something else happening. Underneath all of this, Humans naturally experience something psychologists call cognitive dissonance. That's the mental discomfort that appears when your actions conflict with your self-image. If you see yourself as kind, generous, dependable, always available, then saying no can temporarily feel like identity betrayal. Even if the boundary is completely reasonable, your brain suddenly starts trying to resolve the contradiction. Good. People help others. I said no. So? Am I selfish now? And because the brain hates unresolved tension, it often pushes you toward guilt as a way to restore your old identity. But here's the thing nobody tells you. Enough. Constant self-sacrifice. It is not the same thing as kindness. Sometimes, it's fear wearing a very polite outfit. That sentence makes people uncomfortable. But it matters. Real kindness comes from choice. From emotional freedom, people-pleasing often comes from anxiety. One says, I want to help. The other says, I'm scared not to. Those are psychologically very different experiences, even if the behavior looks identical from the outside. And your body knows the difference. That's why forced yeses feel heavy, where you agree to something and immediately feel your energy collapse, almost like your soul quietly sat down on the floor and sighed. That's not laziness. That's emotional misalignment. Your internal world knows when your outer behavior is dishonest. And over time, constantly abandoning your own needs creates a strange kind of emotional burnout. Not dramatic movie burnout, quiet burnout, the kind where you answer messages slower, feel irritated over tiny things, fantasize about disappearing for a week just to hear your own thoughts again. Your nervous system becomes overstimulated because it never gets to recover. Ironically, people who struggle most with saying no are often deeply empathetic people. They feel other people's disappointment intensely. Their emotional radar is constantly scanning social environments for tension, sadness, disapproval, shifts in tone. Okay from someone else can ruin their entire evening, and empathy is beautiful. It really is, but without boundaries, empathy turns into emotional self-erasure. Slowly disappear from your own life. While trying to make everyone else comfortable inside, there's and here's where things become really interesting psychologically. First boundary usually feels the hardest, not because you're incapable of change, but because your brain hasn't collected evidence yet that you'll survive it. The first time you say no, your nervous system expects catastrophe. You imagine ruined relationships, angry messages, permanent rejection, social exile, like you've been banished from a medieval village for refusing brunch plans. But then something strange often happens. Most people move on. The world doesn't collapse. Some may feel disappointed briefly, yes, but emotionally healthy people usually adapt, and slowly your nervous system starts updating its predictions. Maybe boundaries don't destroy connection after all. That realization changes people, because healthy boundaries don't actually push away the right people. They reveal who only benefited from your lack of boundaries in the first place, and that can be painful too. Discover, sometimes the people most upset by your boundaries were quietly benefiting from your exhaustion, not always maliciously, sometimes unconsciously. Humans adapt to access. If you always overextend yourself, people begin expecting it as normal. So when you suddenly protect your time, energy, or emotional space, it disrupts the pattern to them. It feels like change. To you, it feels like survival. And somewhere in the middle, guilt appears. But guilt is not always proof you're wrong. Sometimes guilt is just the emotional residue of outgrowing old survival strategies. That's such an important distinction because many emotionally exhausted people are not actually failing at boundaries. They're simply grieving the version of themselves that survived by overgiving and grieving identity. Changes can feel surprisingly emotional. There's also a deeper philosophical layer underneath this whole experience. A lot of people secretly believe love must be earned continuously, through usefulness, through availability, through sacrifice, through emotional labor. So when they stop overextending themselves, they fear becoming less lovable. But imagine how exhausting it is to build your self-worth around constant accessibility, that you become emotionally reachable by everyone except yourself. And eventually, your body protests through stress, fatigue, irritability, anxiety, emotional numbness. Your nervous system starts demanding boundaries your mind is too afraid to create. That's why learning to say no is not just communication, it's nervous system retraining. You are teaching your brain that connection and self-protection can coexist. That disappointing someone occasionally does not make you cruel, that rest is not selfish. That your worth does not decrease every time you become less convenient. And honestly, the draining feeling after saying no often fades faster than the exhaustion that comes from betraying yourself repeatedly. That's the part people discover later. At first, boundaries feel heavy. Then they feel unfamiliar. Then eventually, they start feeling peaceful. Not because you stop caring about people, but because you stop abandoning yourself to keep everyone comfortable, and something beautiful happens when you reach that stage. Your yeses become real again. Not obligated, not fearful, not resentful, authentic. You help because you genuinely want to, not because anxiety cornered you emotionally. That changes relationships more than people realize, because healthy connection cannot fully exist where honesty is missing. And pretending you're okay when you're drowning is not honesty, it's survival behavior. So, if saying no drains you right now, it doesn't necessarily mean you're selfish, cold, or becoming a bad person. It may simply mean your nervous system is adjusting to a new reality where your needs finally matter too. And honestly, that adjustment takes time, especially if your entire identity was built around keeping peace, avoiding disappointment, or being the reliable one. Be patient with yourself through that process. Your brain is learning that boundaries are not abandonment, they are balance. And maybe the goal was never to become someone who never feels guilty. Maybe the goal is becoming someone who can tolerate a little guilt without betraying themselves anymore. That's emotional maturity, not perfection, not constant selflessness, not becoming emotionally unavailable. Just learning that your needs deserve a seat at the table too. And if this hit a little too close to home, you're definitely not alone. A lot more people are emotionally exhausted from saying yes than they realize. So I'm curious, what's the hardest thing for you to say no to? Work, family, friends, relationships? Let me know in the comments. Because sometimes the first step toward healthier boundaries is realizing other people are struggling with the exact same thing quietly too.